Father in heaven, we do thank thee, Lord, for thy grace, for thy mercy, for thy goodness to us, and for this opportunity we have to study once again in thy holy word and also in the events that have taken place in this world that thou hast created. Lord, thou knowest all things. I pray that thou wouldst help us to have the proper perspective on this. Help us, O Lord, to remember what we learned so that in all things we can give thee the glory, that we can be aware of what has happened so we can understand what is happening and what is to come. Be with us, I pray, and let every unclean spirit be made powerless in thy sight and through the power of thy holy blood. I ask in the name of the Lord Jesus that thou wouldst strengthen and help us. In thy precious name, Jesus, we pray. Amen. Okay. Now, we've been studying the Roman Empire the past few weeks, and we learned a lot about how they lived, the wars that were fought, the leadership, the generals, all those things about the Roman Empire. Now we're going to look at how that great and mighty iron empire fell. How could so vast an empire, described by the Bible as a dreadful beast, an indescribable but dreadful beast, one that crushed the very residue of that which it destroyed, what could bring an empire like that down? There was nothing in its day that could compare in strength to the Roman Empire. Well, one of the things that contributed to the fall of Rome, which, by the way, took place in 3 stages. Now, I want you to remember that. Rome fell in 3 stages. Now, when you read in Revelation about the third part of something happening, keep that in mind. That history bears this out. Rome fell in 3 different stages or phases. And we'll study all 3 of those, hopefully tonight. In fact, I'm sure we will tonight. Now, what brought the empire down? Well, for one thing, sin always destroys. And these Romans had some problems, did they not? They had problems with drinking. They had problems with idolatry. They had many gods and goddesses. And they had problems with something else called gluttony. They ate themselves into a complete condition of physical and spiritual debauchery. They were a wreck as a result of their indulgences. So what happened to them is they became depraved, immoral beyond belief. In fact, they had certain days when a man who had the power to set the moral standards totally suspended them and said, anything you want to do, you go ahead and do. There is no sin, because he had the power to either put it there or take it away. And he was a man called a what? Do you remember? This man who could set the moral standards? What was he called? We still have them, and they grade books and movies and different things. This man was called a censor. A censor. He could say what was right and wrong. Well, the line kept getting pushed. In other words, the boundary, the parameter of decency, if there was any, there wasn't much there anyway, but it kept getting pushed farther and farther and farther to the point where, since everybody was doing the same thing, they couldn't tell really who was moral and who was immoral. You understand what I'm saying? If everybody's immoral, then there's nobody to stand up and say it's immoral. You know, we used to play this little game when I was a kid. A number of us would get together. We had a science club. We always had my friend Lurch. We call him Lurch because he's a big, tall guy, 6'4", and quite thin with a real deep voice. But anyway, he and I and a number of us had science clubs, and we would go out and we'd watch the stars. We would keep track of the weather, get involved in all kinds of different activities that way. Used to have a lot of fun doing it. I highly recommend constructive things like that. But we used to, sit around and talk about some of these things, and one of the subjects we talked about was, have you ever stopped to think that perhaps everything in this universe is getting bigger or smaller at the same proportional rate, and if it were, you wouldn't know it? What if everything, the bench you're sitting on, the shoes you're wearing, your glasses, your body, everything, what if it's continually getting bigger and everything at the same rate is getting bigger? How could you tell? Or if everything is getting smaller, how could you tell? Silly, maybe, but it was thought-provoking. What I'm trying to illustrate here is the Romans were all immoral, and there was nobody in their empire really that was any different. They all went along with the same thing. You can lose complete track of what's right and what's wrong. You know, there's another little story I think that illustrates that very well. There's a story told of a small town where this man would walk to work every day. Every day he would stop in front of the jewelry store and he would set his watch. And this went on for years. He'd always walk on his way to work and stop at this jewelry store and look in the window at the big clock in the window, and then he would set his watch. And he would move on. Finally, after a couple of years, the proprietor of the jewelry store happened to be near the door, and so he stepped out and he said to this man, I just am curious. You've been stopping in front of my store every day to set your watch. Why do you do that? And every day you do that. And he said, well, you know, the jeweler said, your watch can't be that, inaccurate or unpredictable that you have to set it every day. He said, well, it's like this. He said, I work at the big factory down the street. I'm the timekeeper. I keep track of when starting time is and quitting time, and I blow the quitting whistle at a precise time, and so I want my watch to be absolutely correct because I'm the one who blows the quitting whistle. And the jeweler looked at him in amazement and said, for years I've been setting this clock by that quitting whistle. The problem is they could have been off an hour because there was no true gauge or standard there, cross-check of any kind. And that's how it was in the Roman Empire. Everybody just got the same way. They began to get worse and worse and worse because there was no counter-check to stop them. So they were their own worst enemy and they were destroying themselves. Now, a number of things began to happen in the empire. And I did write some things up on the board. We're not using our big chart tonight because we don't need to. But I've got some dates here that I want you to remember. And the Lord willing, if God would grant me the time where my schedule wouldn't be so cramped, I'd like to do a study guide for you. But just to be safe, maybe you could take some notes. Otherwise, we do have this tape recording. But I want to read some of these dates off here for you, and I'll go back and explain them. The fall of Rome was in 3 stages. And all of this top portion of this board that you see is all stage 1 of the fall of Rome. There's an old saying, Rome wasn't built in a day, neither was it destroyed in a day. This mighty iron empire with a vast armies and all the generals. What brought it down? Well, God brought it down. Actually, the gospel of Jesus Christ brought it down. In 100 to 200 A.D., we can say that Rome reached the apex of its power. Remember that word apex? A-P-E-X. What does that mean? The apex of its power. Apex is what? Shelley? Yeah, the highest point. The apex of its power, its greatest moment, its greatest period of time, you might say. It was during that period of time, 100 to 200, when they were in their golden age and everything was just going marvelously well. Now, when you got to the 300s A.D., Rome began to crack with civil war. In fact, Rome began to be ruled not by individual Caesars so much anymore, but by 2 Caesars at a time. They had what you might call a dynamic duo. They just, because of the unrest, because of all the turmoil, it just developed that way. But there were continual rivalries, and there was civil war all the time. Now, something happened in 303 that's very important to understand. In 303, Diocletian, can you remember that name, Diocletian? Sure you can. Diocletian took control of eastern Rome. Rome as an empire, not a city now, but an empire. Remember, Rome was an empire of a city. It had a capital city. But its empire was far-reaching. Just as Washington, D.C. is a city, but its empire is far-reaching. And we'll get into that when we get into American history. But in 303, Diocletian took control of the eastern half of the Roman Empire. And he made a declaration that Christianity in any form, because it was taking various forms already, Christianity in any form was strictly forbidden, and the Christians were persecuted severely under Diocletian. This went on for exactly 10 years until 313. Now, there's something we'd like to consider in the Bible. I think this is very, very important to understand. I'd like you to look at Ezekiel 4:6 for a moment. Go back to the Old Testament, and we will look at Ezekiel 4, verse 6. Now watch this, because the Lord is explaining something about prophecy and the timing of prophecy. Ezekiel 4:6 says, "And when thou hast accomplished them, lie again on thy right side, and thou shalt bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. I have appointed thee each day for a year." Now, this is what we sometimes refer to as a year for a day, or a day for a year, pardon me, a day for a year prophecy. You might say interpretation of prophecy, a day for a year. Now this is significant because if you go over to Revelation now for a moment, do you see what he said in Ezekiel there? 1 day is a year in prophecy concerning this, concerning Ezekiel specifically, but I think this is applicable elsewhere. If you go over now to Revelation, let's go to chapter 2. Let's look at the 10th verse as the Lord is speaking to a church called Smyrna. Smyrna, remember, comes from the same word that we get myrrh from. And the thing that's characteristic about myrrh is it has to be beaten and pounded before it gives off a sweet fragrance. Just as Christians, when they are persecuted and stay faithful to God, give off a sweetness to the Lord that He'll bless them in. Okay? And Paul the Apostle said that he rejoiced that he would be able to be a partaker of the fellowship of the Lord's suffering. So, if you look at Revelation 2:10, notice something here. "Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that ye may be tried, and ye shall have tribulation 10 days. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life." Could it be that these 10 days here, under Ezekiel 4:14, could it be that if it's a day is a year, that would be the 10 years, exactly 10 years of Diocletian? I would say chances of that are very good. And from 303 to 313, the persecution raged. 10 years exactly. And the Lord told part of the Roman Empire, a church at Smyrna, that they would be persecuted 10 days. Ezekiel said a day is a year. Diocletian's reign was 10 years. You see how precise the Bible is with history? God knows the end from the beginning. He knew this all along. But something took place now in 306. See, the devil began to find out something very quickly. In fact, between 303 and 306, he discovered something. The more you persecute the Christian church, the stronger it gets. It's only phony baloney Christians, make-believers, that crack under persecution. If you are a true Christian, you will never crack under persecution. You will get stronger. That's the character of a true Christian. Just as you can take coal, anthracite coal, and with a long enough pressure and enough time, actually it's really pressure, it becomes a diamond. It doesn't become worth less, it becomes worth more under the pressure. You follow what I'm saying? The reason I said it's more pressure than time, heat and pressure, is because you can make a diamond. You can make one in a few seconds if you have enough heat and enough pressure. It's been done. But anyway, that's the character of a true Christian. But in 306, Constantine, a man named Constantine, took control of the western half of the Roman Empire. Diocletian took the east in 303. Constantine took the west in 306. Now, Constantine really was not content to have just Western Rome. He wanted the whole ball game. So what he did is he played a very crafty game because he was a smart cookie. Instead of being content with just the western half of Rome, he had to figure out a way to unseat Diocletian and get control of all of Rome. Because Rome had been divided and split and torn by civil war for many, many years now. And it was Constantine's desire to put it together as one solid empire once again. That he could be the emperor of all of Rome and revive its golden years. Because it was known now that it was waning in power. So, think about this. What would you do if you were Constantine? You would have to find a way to get support against Diocletian. You would have to find people that didn't like Diocletian. A lot of people that would support you. And perhaps a cause could be provided that would weld the people together and unify them against Diocletian. And if that could be done, he had enough popular support, he could overthrow that man. Well, he did just that. As a matter of fact, Constantine went out, he got acquainted with some of the Christian leaders, kind of got in with them pretty good, because he was thinking, if I could get all the Christians behind me against Diocletian, I can win this battle. I can take over all of Rome again. And so one day he was out among some Christians and he fell to his knees and said, I see a vision. In the sky I see a great cross. And above the cross, as if it were a rainbow forming, arcing above the cross, there are the words, In hoc signo vinces. And of course that's Latin. And I'll write that out for you on this little board. If you bear with me for just a moment. In hoc signo vinces. Like so. I spelled it out for you. That should be a cap. That is supposed to be a capital I. This is just a mark on the board here. It's not a dot for the I. Okay? In hoc signo vinces. That is Latin. It means in this sign conquer. As a matter of fact, if you look in Catholic churches, Lutheran churches, you will sometimes find a symbol, and I'm no artist, but it looks something like this. IHS. Kind of in Roman type writing. This isn't, but I didn't do calligraphy on this board, but IHS stands for in hoc signo, and this sign. In hoc signo vinces, and that refers to Constantine when he supposedly saw this vision. Now, he then instructed all of his supporters that they were to paint a cross on their shields. Now, I'm going to draw a picture of the cross that Constantine saw in the sky and that he had all of his soldiers paint on his shield. That's called an Egyptian ankh. It looks like a capital T with a loop on the top. And in the Egyptian hieroglyphs, they often use this symbol. What that symbol means is that you trust. Now hear me, this is what the symbol means from Egypt and means to witchcraft today. It means that you put your trust in Lucifer or Satan to provide you with your wealth and that you participate in immoral orgies. That's what the ankh means. That's what Constantine saw because that's what was painted on the shields of his soldiers. And because the Christian people, nominal Christians if you want to call them that, because they did not have discernment, they swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. After all, many had lost a lot of loved ones. They had trouble under the persecution, and Constantine was pledged to end the persecution. That sounded mighty good, didn't it? That was the phony peace bait that set the trap. Now, any questions so far or comments on this before I continue? Okay, if some come up, just let me know. Now, well, he claimed he did, and nobody knows. It was just his word against everybody else, and they didn't really doubt him. It was so sensational. People many times will believe what they want to believe. It's kind of like Paul Simon said, from Simon and Garfunkel in one of his songs, a man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest. So they were caught up in the sensationalism of it, just like many people, when they hear somebody say, "Oh, I see a vision," or "I heard God speak to me," they have a propensity to believe it, when we should really have a propensity to scrutinize it with the Word of God and always measure everything with the true measuring stick. Now, we don't know for sure if he really saw it or not. I tend to think he probably did, but it wasn't from God. And many of these churches, these denominational churches, believe it was. And that's why they use the IHS symbol in hoc signo. They look at that as where their church really finally came into its own. Here's what happened. In 313, Constantine sees the vision in hoc signo vinces, and by 324, he had taken all of Rome. In those 11 years that followed his vision, he captured the entire Roman Empire, and it was unified once again. All right, it was as if a deadly wound was healed. Now, what happened is he renamed himself. He was a humble fellow anyway, So Constantine renamed himself, Constantine the Great. And he demanded that everybody refer to him not as Constantine, but as Constantine the Great. And so it was that he took all of Rome, and strangely enough, he moved the capital from the city of Rome to a city called Byzantium. Byzantium was, well, let me show you on a map. I happen to see that it is on this map here. So I'm going to move this on out. Byzantium is at the Bosporus, as we call it. It's a city right here. Right there. The Black Sea is above it. The Aegean Sea, the Hellespont, as they call this little waterway in here, right here. The Aegean Sea and out into the Mediterranean, it is a seaport. It's the outlet for the Black Sea. It connects the Mediterranean Sea by way of the Aegean Sea. You see that right there? That was Byzantium. Byzantium was then renamed. You will never guess what he called it. Constantinople. After himself. Constantine the Great. This was the man who was considered to be the first great Christian of that era, the defender of the faith. Constantine the Emperor, Constantine the Great. Now, he changed it to Constantinople. Currently, that city in our day is called Istanbul. It's still there, intact. Okay? So it was Byzantium, it became Constantinople, now it's Istanbul. And it's a part of Turkey. Controlled, however, by British. Remember, the British controlled all the waterways, and that was an important one. Why? That little area there, and it's a waterway. If you control that, you've got all of Russia locked in, landlocked. That is Russia's only warm water port, and Russia has always wanted it and never could get it, and still doesn't have it, because the British have it. Okay? We'll get back into that later, in due time. So, there he is with a new capital, Constantinople. Now, in 325, 1 year later, after he renamed the capital and so forth, Christianity became the state religion. Do you see what's happening here? God was going to bring the Roman Empire down, but now it was unified. Not only that, it now had Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire. Do you smell a rat? It wasn't true Christianity at all, was it? Okay? As a matter of fact, is this predicted? Did not the Apostle Paul say there'd be a falling away, and a man of sin would be revealed, the son of perdition, who would exalt himself against all things that are called God and everything that's worshipped, and so forth? Well, it was happening. I guess you could say Constantine was really the first pope. Now, the Catholic system would deny it up and down. They say Peter was, but Peter never was in Rome. Okay? And Constantine moved everything over to Constantinople. So, at this point in time, when Christianity became the state religion, it was as if God was saying, enough is enough. Rome has to come down. So what he did is he begins to pour out his wrath on the Roman Empire. For 800 years, no enemy other than Hannibal, and he was a plant. No enemy had touched Roman soil, Italian soil. For 800 years, nobody touched it. Now everybody was coming in like a flood. Briefly, and we're going to look at Scripture on this in a minute, in 409 A.D., the Goths attacked, and they burned the cities in the empire. Every place they went, they left charred, burned, scorched, bloody ruins. That was in 409. In 422, the Vandals built a navy, and the Roman navy, which ruled the seas, the Mediterranean Sea, the Aegean Sea, the Ionian Sea, Adriatic, all the different waterways. The Roman navy controlled these waters for 600 years, and the Vandals, in 30 years, destroyed the entire Roman navy. Kind of amazing, isn't it? In fact, we still use the word vandal, don't we? What does it mean? What is a vandal? What does it mean when you vandalize something? Sam, do you know? If somebody vandalizes something, they come in and they wreck it. Somebody comes along and throws rocks through windows, tips things over, just does property damage, criminal damage to property. We call that person a vandal. They got their name from these Vandals. Vandals were a people. They were a tribe, a barbaric tribe. See, up in northern Europe, and even in eastern Europe, there were many barbaric tribes. There were the Goths, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Heruli, the Huns, the Vandals. the Burgundians, the Franks. There were quite a number of these people, and they were marauding bands that would come riding in and do whatever damage they could. But this was a concerted effort, and the Vandals built this big navy and destroyed the Roman navy in 30 years' time. Then, in 440 A.D., Attila the Hun, with 800,000 soldiers, lined up along the banks of the Danube River, which of course runs through Austria, and began to fight the Roman armies. And every place he went, he won. And strangely enough, his battles were always at rivers. He always fought along a river, and these rivers literally ran with blood. The Rhone, the Marne, the Po rivers. The Rhone, of course, the Marne was in France. The Po River in Italy. But these rivers literally ran red with blood. And you talk about an army of 800,000, that's nearly 1 million soldiers. And he was crushing the Roman army every place he went. In fact, the Roman philosophers referred to this man as the scourge of the rivers. Attila the Hun was called the scourge of the rivers. In fact, when he died, his men buried him under the Danube River. What they did is they diverted the river, they dammed it up and rerouted it temporarily. They dug a big grave, they put Attila the Hun in it, then they undammed the river so it took its original course, and to this day his grave is under the riverbed of the Danube. The scourge of the rivers. Then, in A.D. 476, a man named Odieser. Can you remember Odieser? Odieser, a German, a man from the Rhine River area in Germany, with his army came and took the city of Rome. The city of Rome actually fell to Odieser. He took control of it. Now, all of that was stage one of the whole Roman Empire falling. That was only stage one. Quite an amazing thing, isn't it? Now let's just review what I've talked about a little bit and look at some scripture by comparison. I think you're going to find this rather interesting. If you just bear with me and listen very closely, okay? Fair enough? So I want everybody to be real quiet and listen, because this is rather incredible. It's just amazing. Okay, we talked about God's wrath being poured out, and I think we can find in the Bible where this is documented. Let's go over to Revelation chapter 8. We are going to look at the trumpet judgments. Does everybody understand what I mean by trumpet judgments? You have the seals, the trumpets, and the vials in the book of Revelation. Now we know that the book of Revelation is a book that is written of things which must shortly come to pass, and that was as of way back then. So the book of Revelation is not meant to be scrunched together in the last few years of time, but it is an ongoing process of events and sequence of events that started way back there that were shortly to come to pass and would be ongoing until the Lord himself would finally descend from heaven with a shout and come on horseback from heaven with the armies, his armies with him. Okay? But let's look at Revelation 8, because I believe that God announced the downfall of Rome for its outrages and for Constantine trying to make Christianity his personal state religion. I believe God said enough is enough. And the first trumpet sounded, and what happened? Revelation 8:7 says, the first angel sounded, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood. And they were cast upon the earth, and the third part of trees was burnt up, and all green grass was burnt up. This is an exact description of the Goths coming through and leaving scorched, bloody, desolate cities and destruction, burning destruction. They burned everything. They put everything to the torch, just as it tells us here. And this was the fall upon the empire that was in existence at that time. Now, the second trumpet sounded. And notice how this fits in so well. Look at verses 8 and 9 in regard to the second trumpet. By the way, what does that third mean there? Remember, Rome fell in 3 stages? And the second angel sounded, and as it were a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the, what? Into the sea. And the third part of the sea became blood. What did the Vandals do? They made a navy. They turned those seas into blood by destroying the entire Roman navy in 30 years. And the third part of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died, and the third part of the ships were destroyed. And the third, we'll stop right there in that verse. So, there you have those thirds again. 1/3 of the empire, the first third, was now being destroyed. And that is a perfect description of the Vandals with their navy. Now the Vandals actually came across Gaul and Spain. Now Gaul was France. That's the old name for France. Gaul and Spain went into Africa, built the navy in Africa, went across the Mediterranean Sea, and then destroyed the Roman navy. Any questions? Okay. All right, we have a question? Well, the seas became blood because so many people were killed. It was really an awful thing. And that's just the way wars are. Now, if we look at the next judgment, remember I said Attila the Hun appeared on the banks of the Danube with 800,000 soldiers? And he went west. Moving west, he fought Roman armies, always at the rivers. I had mentioned the Marne, the Rhone, the Po rivers. They literally ran blood red for a while. And I told you about Attila the Hun being buried under the Danube River. If you look at Revelation 8, 10, and 11, it says, "And the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven." I'd like to ask you girls to move down a little over here. If you just move down a little bit so you're not disruptive. Thank you. "And there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon the third part of the what? The rivers." You see how history fits the Bible like a hand in a glove? "And upon the fountains of waters. And the name of the star is called wormwood," which means bitter. "And the third part of the waters became wormwood, and many men died of the waters because they were made bitter." So there is bitterness, there is poison, there is death upon the rivers in the form of a marauding, conquering army that hit the Roman Empire as a flood, and it just left destruction in its wake. Then, look at verse 12. This gets a little interesting. Remember, Odoacer came down from the Rhine country and besieged and captured Rome in AD 476. Notice Revelation 8:12. "And the fourth angel sounded, and the third part of the sun was smitten." Now, what does the sun represent in prophecy language, in metaphor, in word picture, figurative language? It represents leadership. Okay? Third part of the sun was smitten, 1/3 of the leadership, 1/3 of the empire. And the third part of the moon, and the third part of the stars. Now, how do I know that's true? Remember when Joseph had the dream that the sun and the moon and the stars all bowed down to him? His father immediately knew what that meant. He said, "Am I and my mother and thy brethren to bow down before thee?" See, that was the leadership of the family. This is the leadership of an empire. So it's upon the sun, the moon, and the stars, that which is above, the leadership. That's figurative language. And is Revelation written in figurative language? How did Jesus give it to John? He signified it to his servant John. The word signified means to show by signs, figurative language. So as the third part of them was darkened, and the day shone not for the third part of it, and the night likewise. In other words, the leadership was interrupted. There was no certain rule or government anymore. There was an upheaval in leadership, and there was rebellion, and there was anarchy, there was chaos. Now, as I had said, Rome fell in 3 stages. Sometimes I repeat myself a few times to try to get you to remember it. And just jumping ahead, Rome fell. The first stage ended in 476 A.D., with Odoacer taking the city of Rome. The second phase ended in the 600s, when Asia and Africa, those parts of Rome, fell. Do you know when the third part fell? This will surprise you. Way up in 1453 A.D. It took that long for Rome to fall. 1,000 years for it to fall. Isn't that amazing? When Rome did fall, the light of the Roman imperial restraint went out and dark ages of feudalism set in. You know what I mean by that? When Rome ruled, there was a central power, wasn't there? And nobody dared confront Rome. But when Rome was brought down, there was no central leadership anymore. How do you think it would be here in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin, a little city of 14,000, if suddenly it became widely known there would be no more police, no more law enforcement at all? Nobody would be arrested anymore for anything. What would happen? If there were some evil-minded people, and I'm convinced there are some, they would be stealing, they would be injuring people, they would be committing horrible things, rapes and robberies and all kinds of stuff, because there's no restraint. We would thus have what we could call dark ages, a dark age, a dark time. They weren't called dark ages because the sun didn't come up. It came up just like any other era. It was called dark ages because there was no restraint. The central empire was now gone. That started actually in 1453, although the feudalism started before then. It was an ongoing process, but then it really, everything had fallen. And what that meant is everybody formed little cities, little communities, formed their own little, they had a castle they put up or a stronghold to defend themselves against the city down the road, because the city down the road couldn't be trusted. And the one down the road did the same thing because the city down the road from them couldn't be trusted. And nobody trusted each other, and everybody was worried that they'd be attacked some night and die or lose everything they had. What an awful way to live. You see what I'm saying? That's why it was called Dark Ages. As long as Rome was in power, nobody dared step out of line. Now everybody was out of line, and everybody was afraid of everybody else. So every city, every little village, picked the strongest, biggest man there. They all chipped in and bought him a tin suit and made a knight out of him. And then they got him a horse, and he was their defender. Every city, every little village had their knight, their champion. Okay? I'll come back to that when we get into the Dark Ages, probably next week. Now, back to the Roman Empire. We're in the second stage of its fall now. The first stage was completed here when the city of Rome was taken. Now, in 570 AD, now we're going to start the second phase of the fall. In 570 to 632, a man named Muhammad in Arabia, in Mecca to be exact, stood up. Muhammad stood up. He said, I am the prophet of Allah. And a book was produced called the Quran. And he began to preach conquest for Allah, religion by the sword. And they were thus called Saracens, which means a sword fighter. Saracens. The religion was wild and frenzied. These people believed that if they would die in battle, they would immediately go to be with Allah. It was such an honor to die fighting. That if they were bleeding and fighting, they had an honored place in heaven with Allah. And of course, all the followers of Muhammad, all these Arabians, stood up and they would face Mecca and they would worship. And the object of their worship was a black stone called the Kaaba, which they believed was sacred. Because, you see, Muhammad claimed he was a descendant of Abraham. And this stone, this black stone, was sacred, that this was the one that Abraham offered Isaac on, or tried to. And God interrupted him, of course. And so he made all of these lofty claims. And he had all of his followers say these words, and you know, they still say them to this very day, the Muslims. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. That's the first thing any Muslim as a little child learns to say. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. Now, there were, according to the Muslim religion, I don't have time to go into this to a great extent right now, but I will tell you this, and I got this straight from the horse's mouth. I talked to a Muslim woman and got these facts. In Islam, the Muslim religion, they believed there were to be 13 prophets, messiahs, so to speak. There would be 13 of them. There were 12 so far. They believe the 13th one comes at the end of the world. And they're waiting for the 13th prophet right now. Isn't that interesting? 13. Now, Muhammad said, I am the prophet of Allah. We must take the world for Allah. We must shed blood. We must bring religion by the sword. Saracens. He had his own form of cheerleaders. In order to get his armies all whipped up into a frenzy, into a fever pitch, what he did is he had dancers called marabouts. Marabouts. M-A-R-A-B-O-U-T-S. And what they would do is they'd get to dancing in the spirit. And they would spin as they danced. They would spin around. They would fall to their hands. They would sometimes move so quickly that people would literally swear that they were not touching the ground, but they were dancing in air. A spirit would take them. And it was such a wild, frenzied dance that this fervor would catch on, and it would spark the soldiers and cause the impetus to be so great that they would go out and be ready to die immediately for Allah. Remember years ago there was a fad type of a dance called break dancing, where they'd kind of spin around on the sidewalk on the palms of their hands, and it was quite an amazing thing how fast they'd spin. That's very similar to what the marabouts did. It's a spiritual dance, and it's done under the influence of a spirit. And so they would go out and they would try to conquer in the name of Allah. Now, what about these Mohammedans? Well, they set out to destroy Christianity. The only Christianity they knew was Roman Catholicism. Now, God always had remnant Christians that were not Catholic. They had to hide out in the caves, in the dens of the earth, because they were persecuted by everybody, including the Catholic system. But all the Mohammedans knew to be Christian was Catholic. Shelley? Trying to take the whole world. Right. For Allah. So that the whole world would be Muslim. His goal was stamp out all Christianity. Let there be no Christianity of any kind. That was his purpose. Now, let me back up. In 634 A.D., Syria fell to the Mohammedans. Jerusalem fell in 637. Egypt fell in 638. Persia fell in 640. North Africa fell in 689. This was a sweeping conquest. These Saracen fighters were ferocious. Now that meant that the Asian and African Christianity, if you want to call it Christianity, as I said, there was much perversion at that time, but the Asian and African Christianity was thus swept away. Now, when they did that, when they accomplished that, the Muslims then set their sights on Europe. They had already conquered Asia and Africa. Now it was Europe's turn to be beaten down and turned into Muslim. Turned into the Islamic religion, I should say. Spain fell in 711 A.D. as the Saracens attacked and ran across Spain. Next, France was the target. France was falling. But finally, at the city of Tours in 732 A.D., the Muslims were stopped, were defeated, and driven out by a man named Charles Martel, who was the grandfather of Charlemagne, who actually was an emperor over what was called the Holy Roman Empire many, many years later, and we'll come back to that. Thus, at that battle, Islam was kept out of Europe. So that battle literally changed the course of history. Very, very decisive and important battle at Tours, France. Battle of Tours in 732. Now let's look at this Mohammedan army. That was it for the Muslims. They never could take Europe. That finished them right there. Are they described in the Bible? Well, let's just read part of Scripture here. Let's go over to Revelation chapter 9. Okay, I'll give you a moment to get there. Okay, listen to what it says here in verse 1. Revelation 9:1. And the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth, and to him was given the key of the bottomless pit. And he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose a smoke out of the pit, as the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. Now what is represented there in prophetic language, figurative language? Smoke out of a pit represents a false doctrine, a sweeping false doctrine, a smoke screen, you might say. And there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth. From the false doctrine, the product of the false doctrine, was an army. I believe this is the Islamic army, the Arabian Islamic army here. And there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth, and unto them was given power, as the scorpions of the earth have power. It's interesting here, because they're compared to locusts. Do you know where locusts originate in that part of the world? Arabia. These were Saracens. They used only swords. So they had stings, as it were, like a scorpion would. And it was commanded them that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, neither any green thing, neither any tree, but only those men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads. Now notice something here. One of the fundamental doctrines of Islam is every tree and every green thing is sacred. It's written in the Koran. They are never to harm vegetation, only people. But what is it saying here? God was protecting his true Christians. Okay? You know what this means? Do you know why the Islamic people hated the Roman Catholic Church so much? Because they hated idols, statues. They believed it was an abomination. True Christians didn't have those anyway. They had the mark of God in their foreheads. They didn't have idols. In other words, only those so-called Christians that had idols could be hurt. Because the Muslims wouldn't hurt anybody unless they had idols. See how the Lord works this out? And to them it was given that they should not kill them, but that they should be tormented 5 months, and their torment was as the torment of a scorpion when he striketh a man. In other words, a stabbing wound. Saracens, sword fighters. Okay, and their purpose wasn't to totally obliterate them, to totally kill them, but to take control of them. Now, the Catholics were very unique. In their allegiance to the Pope and to Rome, they would rather die than become Muslims. But the Muslims didn't want to kill them. They wanted to make Muslims out of them. Notice, in those days shall men seek death and shall not find it, and shall desire to die, and death shall flee from them. When they would conquer an area, they would say, look, we don't want to kill you, but you're going to have to become a Muslim. We'd rather die. Well, you're not going to die. You're going to be a Muslim. See how that works? Okay? And the shapes of the locusts were like unto horses prepared unto battle, and on their heads were as it were crowns like gold, and their faces were as the faces of men, and they had hair as the hair of women, and their teeth were as the teeth of lions, and they had breastplates as it were breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was as the sound of chariots of many horses running to battle. And they had tails like unto scorpions, and there were stings in their tails, and their power was to hurt men 5 months. Now watch something here, and I'll come back to verse 11. Notice, they had tails. You know where the Saracens wore their swords? At their sides, so that it would project and stick out toward their posterior, looking like a tail. Okay? Furthermore, here's a description of the Muslim armies. This is what the Saracen fighters looked like. They were fierce, relentless horsemen. They had beards, but they had long hair like women. So they had the face of men, they had beards. They had long hair like women's hair. They had yellow turbans on their heads. Notice, crowns of gold here in the Bible. And they had iron coats of armor. This scriptural description is a perfect description of the Arabian, Islamic, Mohammedan army. You couldn't get a better description. Furthermore, in verse 11 it says, and they had a king over them, which is the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, but in the Greek tongue hath his name Apollyon, which means destroyer. Okay? It gets real interesting here because I gave you a description of the Muslim army, didn't I? They had the yellow turbans on, and they had capes too. It talks about their wings, the noise of their wings. They all wore capes. They dressed mostly in yellow. Now, we said smoke from the pit was false doctrine. We said grass and greenery was sacred to them. We also said that they were compared to locusts, and you know what the normal stay of locusts was? 5 months. When the locusts appeared in that area of the world, it was always May through September. May through September. You got that? That's 150 days. Now, what did Ezekiel say? A day is what? A year. That would be 150 years. The Muslim conquest lasted exactly 150 years, from A.D. 630 to A.D. 780. In 786, the Muslims finally completely settled down, but their wars stopped after precisely 150 years, which is the same as 150 days, the normal stay of locusts. I think this is absolutely amazing. You couldn't get any clearer than this. Now, I think, well, we've got 10 minutes left, so I think we're going to use it up. I'd like to finish this up. Now, any objections? Good. Didn't give me much chance to respond, did I? Now, how about the last stage of the fall of Rome? Now, I don't have that on the board because I didn't have room for it on the board. So you're going to have to just listen carefully as I tell you about it. The last stage of the fall of the Roman Empire started in 1057 A.D. when the sixth trumpet sounded. Vast hordes of Turks gathered at the Euphrates River. Now, the Euphrates River is the natural border of East and West. These cruel Turks replaced the Arabs as rulers of the Muslim world. The Arab Muslims could not take Europe. The Turks said, we will take Europe for Allah. These Turkish Muslims were so religious about their religion by war that they had a doctrine. If they unsheathed their sword, if they pulled their sword, they could not put it away without blood on it. And if they pulled their sword and they hadn't killed somebody, or at least injured somebody, had somebody's blood on their sword, they had to cut themselves before they could put their sword back. And they didn't want to do that, so they made sure somebody got cut when they pulled that sword out. That's how nasty they were. Okay? Now these Turks started fighting. They fought the Roman Empire at Constantinople, named for Constantine. Constantine was long dead. But in 1453, the Battle of Constantinople, artillery with gunpowder was used for the very first time. Nobody had ever seen it before, and it was used there. Now, look at Revelation 9:17. And thus I saw the horses in the vision, and them that sat on them having breastplates of fire, and of jacinth and brimstone. And the heads of the horses were as the heads of lions, and out of their mouths issued fire and smoke and brimstone. Do you know what gunpowder looks like when it goes off? Gunpowder consists of 75 parts potassium nitrate, 13 parts carbon, and 12 parts sulfur, brimstone. If you look at the sixth angel sounding in verse 13, it says, the sixth angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar which is before God, and saying to the sixth angel which had the trumpet, loose the four angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates, that have that restraining power. Okay? And the four angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour and a day and a month and a year, for to slay the third part of men. And the number of the army of the horsemen were 200,000, and I heard the number of them. He heard a number here. He didn't see particularly everything that he heard. Notice there's a difference between seeing a number and hearing a number. That's important in several places in the Bible. But nevertheless, this was without a doubt the Turkish army which gathered at the Euphrates. History bears this out. Furthermore, to cement the fact, these Turks were conquering everything everywhere. I want to give you another Bible formula in a minute here, but they kept winning. They marched into Central Europe. They crossed the Carpathian Mountains, went into Austria. They were going to come into Europe from the underside, through Austria. They were defeated in Vienna by a Polish army under General John Sobieski. That was the end of the Turkish Muslims. So Europe was saved from Islam, from the Muslim religion, once again, 1,000 years after it was saved the first time. Now notice in Revelation 9:15 it talks about an hour, a day, a month, and a year. Well, an hour indicates a short time, but it's the shortest measurement of time that you find in the Bible. But if you take hour, day, month, and year, you can't do much with an hour here as far as the prophecy language. Remember, a day is a year? But add up the day, month, and year. 365, 30, and 1. A year is 365 days. A month is 30 days. A day is 1 day. That equals 396, doesn't it? From 1057, the year 1057, when the Turks crossed the Euphrates, to the fall of Constantinople in 1453, which was the third stage of the Roman Empire falling, was exactly 396 years. In other words, if you add a year, a month, and a day together, and if you want to add the hour in there, you're welcome to do so. But if you add those up, you come to 396 prophetic days equaling 396 prophetic years. And it was 396 years from 1057 until 1453. Another indicator from the Bible that this was indeed the Turkish Muslim army unleashed to destroy the third part of Rome, but yet to be stopped in Europe so that they could spread no further. Thus, those three great segments of world history show the fall of the Roman Empire in 3 stages. And that's basically what I've got for you tonight. Any questions? Any discussion? Okay? Yes, I cited that, but that was actually the ending spot. Yeah, the way I did it may look a little strange there, but I wanted to cite that example of the gunpowder being used, because that was used for the first time ever at that Battle of Constantinople. In other words, when Rome finally fell, its third and last stage, it was with gunpowder. It was with smoke, fire, and brimstone. Okay? Yeah, they were stopped from going into Europe. They were defeated in Vienna by John Sobieski to keep them from going into Europe. Okay? But they had beaten the existing last part of the Roman Empire at Constantinople. In other words, they were stopped in one direction, but they did finalize the job of destroying the Roman Empire. See, John Sobieski had nothing to do with the Roman Empire. He was European. Okay? Other than, well, the Catholic system, there is an overlap here with what was called the Holy Roman Empire. But I'm talking basically about the physical Roman Empire now. See, what's happening here is God had raised up the Muslim army, first the Arabs and then the Turks, in order to put down the final remnant of what was left of the Roman Empire. All right? That was accomplished at Constantinople. But when they had tried to go into Europe, they were stopped by John Sobieski. It would help, I suppose, if I put this in a timeline, in a study guide. Maybe I can do that by next time. No, they defeated the Roman armies. But they defeated those in control of Constantinople. Yeah, that was still held by the Romans. No, it was the Turks. It was the Turks that actually had come up with that. See, gunpowder was something that actually came out of China. And Marco Polo had discovered, the Chinese had this, they had invented this. It's almost a natural substance, really, because potassium nitrate, also called saltpeter, can be found in abundance in certain areas, especially in Cathay or China. And so can sulfur. And if you just mix sulfur and potassium nitrate together with a little charcoal, which is also abundant wherever anything burns, you've got an amazing explosive. In fact, when I was a kid, I always used to take potassium nitrate and mix sugar with it because there's a lot of carbon in sugar. And I mixed that half and half and put it in a big piece of newspaper and roll it up and light it on fire, and you would get a flare like you wouldn't believe. It would burn intensely. In fact, it would burn underwater. So anyway, they had discovered that in Cathay, in China. Cathay is another word for China. It was a Cantonese invention. Okay, it's 8 o'clock exactly, and our time is up. If this is confusing to anybody, I'll do my best to have a study guide for you next time. And I think that what I'm going to do is probably arrange for a test after we finish the European section before we get into the American history. We're going to do this in 2 stages. Oh, we'll have about 100 questions on the test. I just want to see if they remembered the high points. It won't be so bad. Okay, let's stand together. We'll end with prayer. Father in heaven, again, we thank Thee that we could be here tonight. I pray that we'd remember these things, and I pray that the children would find these things to be interesting and that they would not forget, all to Thy glory. Help us, I pray, in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. Very good. Thank you for coming.